Taking a step back from DMVR videos and wanting to do more heavy editing on my own videos, I decided to take a look at an archetype that I've fallen in love with, that being Pendulum Magicians, in a video format that's totally original. Introduced as one of the archetypes used by the main protagonist of Arc 5, Sakaki Yuya, and by extension the final villain of that series, Zark, Pendulum Magicians are a bunch of spellcasters based around the summoning mechanic that was introduced with that series, Pendulum Summon. They were once a meta deck that was eventually power crept, nerfed, and slaughtered by the ban list. Recently they've been slowly getting back their pieces off the ban list due to the new set Dimension Force being released. Currently the deck's playstyle boils down to getting out generic extra deck monsters, as Pendulum monsters pave the way for that kind of playstyle, as well as getting their scales to be destroyed by card effect. We'll start off with the two titular Pendulum Magicians introduced to us through the anime, Stargazer Magician and Timegazer Magician, as well as their non-Pendulum Magician counterpart, Astrograph Sorcerer and Chronograph Sorcerer. Stargazer Magician is a level 5 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 1 and has 1200 attack points and 2400 defense points. His monster effect reads, once per turn, when exactly one other Pendulum monster you control and no other cards is returned to the hand by an opponent's card effect, except during the damage step, you can special summon one monster from your hand with the same name as that returned to the hand. This is very situational at best, useless at worst, as it rarely, if ever, will be used and was only added to help Yuya get out of a very situational situation in one singular episode and was never used again. His Pendulum effect reads, if a Pendulum monster you control battles, your opponent cannot activate spell cards until the end of damage step. Unless you have a Magician card or Odd Eyes card in your other Pendulum zone, this card's Pendulum scale becomes 4. The first effect only exists to help Yuya out when he magically created Pendulum cards out of nowhere. Needless to say, this effect is not useful at all and probably was never relevant even when Pendulums were introduced back in 2014. To top off the already abysmal Pendulum effect, Konami at the time decided it was best to give this card a restriction that turns it into a scale 4 instead of being a scale 1, which I can only guess is to stop people from splashing this card into decks at the time. Overall, this card has an awkward level as well as an abysmal monster effect and Pendulum effect. You certainly don't want to run this card unless you're playing his sorcerer counterpart, Astrograph Sorcerer, in which case you run 1. Although I wanted to talk about Astrograph Sorcerer in the support section, can't really talk about Stargazer Magician and by extension Timegazer Magician without mentioning both their upgraded counterparts. Astrograph Sorcerer is a level 7 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose scale is 1, has 2500 attack points and 2000 defense points. His monster effect reads, if a card or cards you control is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can special summon this card from your hand. Then, you can choose one monster in your graveyard, extra deck, or that is banished and that was destroyed this turn, and add one monster with the same name from your deck to your hand. You can banish this card you control, plus 4 monsters from your hand, field, and or graveyard, one each with Pendulum Dragon, Xyz Dragon, Synchro Dragon, and Fusion Dragon in their name. Special summon one Supreme King Zark from your extra deck. This is treated as a fusion summon. So if a card you control is destroyed, you can special summon him and search a copy of whatever was destroyed, all in one effect, and in a Pendulum Magician deck you want to be destroying your cards, such as Wisdom-Eye Magician or Double Iris Magician. The second effect to fusion summon Supreme King Zark isn't really relevant unless you're making a Zark deck, but even then it's easier to use the Odd Eyes extra deck monsters to make Zark with. Oh, this was before Vertu was banned. Well, never mind then. His Pendulum effect reads, during your main phase you can destroy this card, and if you do, take one Stargazer Magician from your hand or deck and either place it in your Pendulum zone or special summon it. You can only use this effect of Astrograph Sorcerer once per turn. You don't use Astrograph Sorcerer for its Pendulum effect unless you're really desperate for a second monster on the field, either to link climb into Appaloosa for synchro shenanigans, or to search off Star Pendulumgraph. It destroying itself in the Pendulum scale can also trigger another copy of itself in hand to special summon the extra copy and search for the third one, or to get Chronograph Sorcerer onto the field as well. The first situation I mentioned is probably not going to happen since that would be illegal. It's played at one copy only due to the ban list. Astrograph is a key piece in Pendulum Magicians due to his monster effect not being a once per turn at all and helping you generate advantage from losing your scales. If he were legal at free, you play him at free, no questions asked. but sadly, at the time of writing, you can only play him at 1 copy, which I can see changing to be 2 copies or 3, since what made him so broken, Electrumite, is bad and for very good reason. Next we have the older brother, assuming from the wrinkles on his face, Timegazer Magician. Timegazer Magician is a level 3 dark attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 8, has 1200 attack points and 600 defense. His monster effect reads, each turn, the first card or cards in your pendulum zone that would be destroyed by opponent's card effect is not destroyed. Situationally okay, the continuous effect can be helpful, but realistically, Timegazer Magician isn't going to be on the field for this effect to matter. His pendulum effect reads, you must control no monsters to activate this card. If a pendulum monster you control battles, your opponent cannot activate trap cards until the end of damage step. Unless you have the Magician card or Odd Eyes card in your other pendulum zone, this card's pendulum scale becomes 4. On top of already restrictive scale changing effect, Konami decided it was best to add in another restriction where you can only activate Timegazer as a scale only if you control no monsters. What's the point? It was already balanced enough for an early pendulum, but to add this extra restriction, presumably because it's a high scale, is adding salt to the wounds. The other effect only exists for the same reason as his younger brother. Why? Because anime. Overall, like his younger brother, the monster and the pendulum effects of Timegazer is nothing to write home about, and is in fact worse than Stargazer himself. The only saving grace about Timegazer is that his level can potentially give you more flexibility for synchro summons, and you only play Timegazer because you play the sorcerer counterpart, Chronograph sorcerer, which then means you play 1, otherwise don't play him. Like with Astrograph Sorcerer, I wanted to talk about this card in the support section, but you can't exactly talk about Timegazer Magician without talking about Chronograph Sorcerer. Chronograph Sorcerer is a level 6 dark attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 8 and has 2000 attack points and 1700 defense. His monster effect reads, if a card or cards you control is destroyed by battle card effect, you can special summon this card from your hand, then you can special summon 1 monster from your hand. You can manage this card you control plus 4 monsters from your hand, field, and or graveyard, 1 each with Pendulum Dragon, Xyz Dragon, Synchro Dragon, and Fusion Dragon in their name. Special summon 1 Supreme King Xiangke from your extra deck. This is treated as a fusion summon. Like with Astrograph Sorcerer, Chronograph can summon itself when another card you control is destroyed, but unlike Astrograph, you don't get to search an extra copy of whatever you control that was destroyed. Instead, you get to special summon a monster from your hand. This is certainly useful in some situations where you want to get a second body onto the field without wasting your normal or pendulum summon, either to link summon beyond the pendulum, or if you're in the OCG, make Electrumite. Just like with Astrograph, the second effect to fusion summon Supreme King Xiangke isn't really relevant unless you're making a Xiangke deck. His pendulum effect reads, during your main phase you can destroy this card, and if you do, take 1 Timegazer Magician from your hand or deck and either place it in your pendulum zone or special summon it. You can only use this effect of Chronograph Sorcerer once per turn. Same as Astrograph, this card can destroy itself in the scales and either replace itself with Timegazer Magician or special summon Timegazer onto the field. I have a more personal preference for this, as Timegazer's level is much more easier to use for synchro summons instead of Stargazer Magician with the other Pendulum Magicians. Overall, Chronograph is a fine card to use in Pendulum Magicians for the extra body it provides with either effects. You can run 3 copies if you wish, but there are Pendulum Magician decks that have opted to either play 2 copies due to how tight the main deck space is, or not play Chronograph at all. It is down to your personal preference. Next up from the anime, we have Xiangke Magician. Xiangke Magician is a level 7 dark attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 3. His attack and defense are 2500 and 500 respectively. His monster effect reads, once per turn, during either player's turn, you can target 1 light monster in the field. That face-up monster has its effects negated until the end of this turn. A quick effect negate on a light attribute monster. Situationally decent, and surprisingly does come up from time to time due to the abundance of light attribute monsters in this game. His pendulum effect reads, once per turn, you can target 1 face-up Xyz monster you control. This turn, you can use it as Xyz material for an Xyz summon using its rank as if it were a level, even if this card leaves the field. A gimmicky effect for a gimmicky summoning condition on monster types that I wish Konami would explore more outside of the anime influences. Yes, I'm aware Symphonic Warriors gained a synchro pendulum, same for Plunder Patrol, which makes me happy that they brought back this card type and are willing to explore this idea more, as well as give it to archetypes outside of the anime. Overall, having decent stats for rank 7 plays, as well as decent attack stats, decent monster effects for certain situations, but a lackluster, albeit funny, gimmicky pendulum effect and a scale that borders close to being unusable lowers this card's usage. I've seen 1 or 2 decks utilize a singular copy of this card, but the majority don't run this. Run one or none, leaning more towards the latter, but up to your preference and deck's playstyle. It should be included in your deck if you're playing a Pendulum Magician variant that focuses more on the Xyz plays. Onto the high scale counterpart of Xiangke Magician, we have Xiangchen Magician. She's a level 4 light attribute, spellcaster type effect pendulum monster, whose pendulum scale is 8. Her attack and defense are 500 attack and 1500 defense. Her monster effect reads, your opponent takes no battle damage from attacks involving this card. Once per turn, you can target one other face-up monster you control. This card's attack becomes equal to that monster's current attack until the end of this turn. I don't even know what to say about this effect. Sure, your attack can become the same as another monster you control, but in exchange, your relevancy will be non-existent. Her pendulum effect reads, once per turn, you can target one face-up Xyz monster you control and one level 5 or higher monster you control. That Xyz monster's rank becomes equal to the level of that level 5 or higher monster until the end of this turn, even if this card leaves the field. While you control more cards than your opponent does, this card's pendulum scale becomes 4. Why? Why did Konami think she needs a nerf with her scale being restricted like Timegazer and Stargazer, and somehow being even worse with the restriction? Overall, just don't bother with her unless you want to play her for the full roleplay experience or the waifu factor. Don't. Moving away from the anime magicians, we move on to the next magicians introduced to us in the Master of Pendulum structure deck. First of which will be the vanilla pendulum monster, Dragonpulse Magician. He's a level 4, Earth attribute, spellcaster type, normal pendulum monster, whose pendulum scale is 1, with his attack and defense being 1800 and 900 respectively. Dragonpulse's flavor text reads, this boy magician has the gift of seeing the natural lines of energy that run through the earth, which his people call the pulse of the dragon. His exuberance and skill put him in high regards with his mentor, the Dragonpit magician. The natural lines of energy in this flavor text is a reference to Taoism, with the dragon's vein, which essentially boils down to cosmic energy from the sky channeled through the mountains and into the earth. I'm not 100% sure of that summary, but that is the gist of what I know. Some pretty neat stuff. His pendulum effect reads, once per turn, if you have a magician card in your other pendulum zone, you can discard one pendulum monster, then target one face-up monster in the field, destroy it. Essentially, this pendulum effect is a more restrictive Raigeki break that is easier to get rid of. At the time of release, this card had seen moderate use, but as time went on, the usage of this card had dropped and been power crept out of relevancy, due to the rise of newer magicians that have better support as well as overall help focus more on the extra deck plays. Dragonpulse Magician was serviceable and much more useful than the two anime pendulums, but you most likely don't want to run this card unless it's out of nostalgia. Swinging to the opposite end of the pendulum, get it? We move on to the mentor of Dragonpulse Magician, Dragonpit Magician. Dragonpit Magician is a level 7 water attribute spellcaster type normal pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 8 and has 900 attack and 2700 defense. Dragonpit Magician's flavor text reads, this gifted magician can awaken the energy stored in the deep places of the earth known as the pits of the dragon. His stoic approach wins him few friends, and he often bends to the desire of his pupil. Delving more into Taoism that I am unfamiliar with, as well as basically telling us he's a bit of a grumpy old man, which sounds about right with his card artwork. Moving on to his pendulum effect, it reads, once per turn, if you have a magician card in your other pendulum zone, you can discard one pendulum monster, then target one spell trap card on the field, destroy it. Overall, not a bad effect for a pendulum effect and was used when first introduced, but nowadays it has niche uses, with most people opting to not run this card. This card had its time to shine in the spotlight, but its 15 minutes of fame is over, and its power crept out of relevancy. Although, it pops up now and again due to its high level being used for rank 7 plays like Absolute Dragon, as well as being a high scale that can remove back row or be a big body on the field. You either play this card at 1 or none at all. It depends on the format since the side deck for back row removal exists. Moving on to the next pendulum monster, we have one of the best pendulum magicians out there, Oafdragon Magician. Oafdragon is a level 6 wind attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 2, has 2100 attack and 1400 defense. Oafdragon's monster effect reads, if this card is normal or special summon, you can target one Magician Pendulum monster or Odd Eyes monster in your graveyard except Oafdragon Magician. Add it to your hand. You can only use this effect of Oafdragon Magician once per turn. Situationally decent and has helped me out of a pinch by recovering resources I had to discard, but you'll most likely play Oafdragon for his Pendulum effect. Speaking of which, his Pendulum effect reads, if you have a Magician card in your other Pendulum zone, you can add one face-up Magician or Odd Eyes Pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand, except Oafdragon Magician. You can only use this effect of Oafdragon Magician once per turn. This effect is why you play Oafdragon. Being able to recycle your resources in a place that now has been restricted with the existence of links is extremely beneficial, more so with two other magicians we'll be talking about later. With the existence of links, Oafdragon has become one of the best pendulum magicians, since being able to grab a pendulum magician back from the extra deck and being able to summon them to the main monster zone instead of just pendulum summoning one monster to the extra monster zone is valuable. Yes, his pendulum effect is restricted, but if you're playing a pendulum magician deck, it won't matter that much, though the once per turn is a bit of a hindrance. His monster effect is since you use Oafdragon mostly for his pendulum effect. Play 3 copies of this card, although I've seen people run and suggest 2, but personally I'd say play 3. Next up we have Noble Dragon Magician, the female counterpart for Oafdragon Magician. Noble Dragon Magician is a level 3 fire attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum tuner monster whose pendulum scale is 5 and has 700 attack as well as 1400 defense. Her monster effect reads, cannot be used as synchro material except for the synchro summon of a dragon synchro monster. If this card is used as synchro material, unless all other synchro materials are Odd Eyes monsters, place this card on the bottom of the deck. If this card is in your hand or graveyard, you can target one level 7 or higher Odd Eyes monster you control. Reduce its level by 3, and if you do, special summon this card. I don't know why this card has a ton of restrictions. The graveyard effect is decent if you're playing an Odd Eyes deck, although I'm not sure if they play her. Her pendulum effect reads, unless you have a Magician card in your other pendulum zone, destroy this card. That's it. This pendulum effect seems very counterintuitive to what her monster effect is intended for. Overall, I think she's just better off in an Odd Eyes deck rather than a Pendulum Magician deck. Don't play her unless it's in Duel Links, where she is the Dark Worm for Pendulum Call. Now, we have one of the more unknown Pendulum Magicians, with a pairing quite frankly I didn't know he existed until I came across him when Pendulums were first introduced in Duel Links. Dharma-eye Magician is a level 7 light attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 2, has 2000 attack and 2500 defense. His monster effect reads, while this pendulum summon card is on the field, Magician pendulum monsters you control cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effect during the turn this card was pendulum summoned. The protection effect is fine, but to have it restricted to the turn it was pendulum summoned is a bit disappointing to say the least. His pendulum effect reads, once per turn you can reveal one pendulum monster in your hand, then target one Magician card in your pendulum zone. That target's pendulum scale becomes the same as the revealed pendulum monster until the end of this turn, even if this card leaves the field. Revealing hand knowledge to modify the other scale's scale is not a great effect, and doesn't really help with the Pendulum Magician's playstyle as well as their game plan. Dharma-eye Magician is a product of its time, since half of the released Pendulum Magicians at the time of its release had the weird scale modulation restriction that Dharma-eye tries to solve, but as a result, was left behind in the dust as more support for the archetype was released. Don't run any, even just for a level 7 beatstick, as a Xiangke Magician outclasses it with a more useful monster effect. Next up in the Pendulum Magician line, we have Wisdom-eye Magician. Like with Oafdragon Magician, Wisdom-eye Magician is one of the best Pendulum Magicians to be made for the archetype. Wisdom-eye is a level 4 light attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 5 and has 1500 attack and 1500 defense. His monster effect reads, you can discard this card and target one card in your pendulum zone whose current pendulum scale is different from its original pendulum scale. Its pendulum scale becomes its original pendulum scale until the end of this turn. Like with Dharma-eye Magician, Wisdom-eye's monster effect sought to fix half of that at the time only available Pendulum Magician scale modulation restriction, which, while valiant effort, ultimately won't matter as time goes on. I even wish they had a different monster effect. His pendulum effect reads, if you have Magician or Performapal card in your other pendulum zone, you can destroy this card, and if you do, place one Magician Pendulum monster from your deck in your Pendulum zone except Wisdom-eye Magician. This effect alone saves Wisdom-eye and makes it one of the best scales for the deck. Being able to tag itself out for any other Magician through destruction no less helps circumvent the issue of the deck. Having so many good high scales, but barely any good low scales, with Oafdragon being the only exception thus far. And because it's through destruction, this can trigger both Astrograph or Chronograph's effect, either letting Astrograph search another copy of Wisdom-eye, or Chronograph special summoning another body to link climb. This also applies to triggering Star Pendulumgraph's effect to help you search out for what you are missing, most likely Harmonizing Magician, which we will talk about her later. Wisdom-eye is a fine piece of support for the deck. Not only being able to replace itself with any other Magician in the scales, but also being a level 4 monster allowing for rank 4 plays. You play Wisdom-eye not for his monster effect, but for his Pendulum effect, which completely overshadows his own monster effect by a long shot. Play 3 copies. Now we've reached one of the standalone Pendulum Magicians, which also appeared in the anime, Timebreaker Magician. I say standalone, but the more I think about it, this card could be paired with Harmonizing Magician. They're both child magicians that technically have appeared in the anime, with Timebreaker appearing in the anime fully, whereas Harmonizing is a retrain of Tuning Magician, which appeared in the anime as well. Not only that, but both of them were introduced in the Synchro arc of Arc 5. The connection also goes to the background artwork of both cards, with Timebreaker Magician's background artwork showcasing clock rings that are very reminiscent of the tuner rings used in the Synchro animation for the Synchro summon in the anime. Moving on to the review. Timebreaker Magician is a level 3 dark attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 2 and has 1400 attack and 0 defense. His monster effect reads, when this card is pendulum summoned from the hand and no other cards are pendulum summoned at the same time, you can make this card's attack become double its original attack. Once per turn, you can target one monster in the field, banish both it and this card from the field until your next standby phase. The double attack is and I know it only exists because of the anime. The other effect being a spell speed 1 spot removal is decent, but again, it's spell speed 1. And your opponent has to have a monster, which they will, and it will be negates, making this card, which has no protection at all, very meh. His pendulum effect reads, each turn the first pendulum monster or monsters you control that would be destroyed by an opponent's card effect is not destroyed. A very pendulum effect, since usually you don't leave your main deck pendulum monsters on the field, they're there to be used as material for extra deck plays. However, this effect is used in tandem with extra deck pendulum hybrids such as Nirvana High Paladin. The only problem with that is there are no decent extra deck hybrids that pendulum magicians can reliably play and are not part of a different archetype. Overall, a meh monster whose saving grace being that it's a level 3, a low scale, and a pendulum effect, waiting for the right hybrids to come along and be abused, which won't be for a while. Play none. Next up, we have another standalone Pendulum Magician that also appeared in the anime, only once and never again. Acrobat Magician. Acrobat Magician is a level 5 dark attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 2, has 800 attack and 2300 defense. His monster effect reads, if the activation of a spell / trap card is negated, except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. When this card is destroyed by battle, you can place this card in your pendulum zone. Used by Yuya to summon itself when Jack negated his action spell card and then to die immediately afterwards in order to trigger its second effect, this gimmicky effect is alright, but meh at best. Let's just hope your opponent doesn't have Ash in response to spell or traps instead. His pendulum effect reads, when a monster or monsters you control is destroyed by a card effect, except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your pendulum zone. You can only use this effect of Acrobat Magician once per turn. Funnily enough, this effect was never used in the anime, so with no basis to go on, this pendulum effect is meh. Like sure, you can special summon this card when a monster you control is destroyed by a card effect, and then when Acrobatic Magician is destroyed by battle, he returns back to the pendulum zone. But there are much better pendulum effects, and makes you wish Acrobatic Magician had a different pendulum effect. Overall, Acrobatic Magician is meh support that doesn't really help out the playstyle of the deck, and to make matters worse, it's a level 5, which the only other level 5 in Pendulum Magician is Stargazer Magician, meaning rank 5 plays are out of the question for this card. Don't play this card unless you're going for something gimmicky. Moving on to the next standalone Pendulum Magician, one which also appeared in the anime once and never again, we have Dragoncaller Magician. Dragoncaller Magician is level 7 dark attribute spellcaster type effect pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 2, has 2400 attack and 1000 defense. His monster effect reads, once per turn you can also make this card become dragon type until the end of this turn. A monster that was Fusion, Synchro, or XZ summoned using this card on the field as material gains this effect. If this card battles a Dragon type monster, this card's attack becomes double its original attack during the damage step only. A mediocre effect to help extra deck monsters, more so for the summon of Odd Eye's Raging Dragon and Odd Eye's Rebellion Dragon, due to their need of specific materials. His Pendulum effect reads, once per turn, you can target one face-up monster on the field, it becomes a Dragon type until the end of your opponent's turn, even if this card leaves the field. A very meh Pendulum effect for a very specific situation, which at that point you're better off playing a deck that literally focuses on Dragon types, which for a Pendulum deck would be an Odd Eyes deck. Overall, bad support for Pendulum Magicians due to its anime gimmicky origins. The only saving grace of this is that it's a low scale and a level 7, allowing for rank 7 plays or Synchro 8 plays, but by then you're better off running any of the other level 7 Pendulum Magicians. Don't play this card. Next up we have one of, if not the best Pendulum Magician to ever grace this archetype, Harmonizing Magician. She's a level 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum Tuner monster, whose Pendulum scale is 8, has 0 attack and 0 defense. Her monster effect reads, cannot be special summoned from the extra deck, cannot be used as material for a Fusion, Synchro, or XZ summon unless all other materials are Magician Pendulum monsters. When this card is Pendulum summoned from the hand, you can special one Magician Pendulum monster from your deck in defense position except Harmonizing Magician, but negates its effects, also banish it when it leaves the field. You can only use this effect of Harmonizing Magician once per turn. Despite all the negative restrictions she has, being able to tutor out any Pendulum Magician from the deck and being a tuner herself allows you to do so much, from link climbing into any link 2s to making any generic Synchro 8s or 10s like Borreload Savage Dragon or Baron de Fleur, as well as rank 4s like Timestar Magician, Time Thief Redoer, Abyss Dweller, etc. Her Pendulum effect reads, all monsters you control gain 100 attack and defense for each face-up Magician Pendulum monster with different names in your extra deck. Decent effect for a scale 8, but hardly relevant when the other scale 8 Pendulum Magicians have much better Pendulum effects. Overall, Harmonizing Magician is a very versatile support for Pendulum Magicians, and mainly played as a monster rather than as a high scale, unless you have no choice. Play 3 copies of her, no exceptions. Moving on to my favourite selection of Pendulum Magicians, we have the Xiangke Magicians. The Xiangke Magicians are the Pendulum Magician counterparts of the Dimension Dragons and were designed as support to summon Supreme King Xiangke. Moving on to the first of the Xiangke Magicians, we have Purple Poison Magician. He's a level 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 1, has 1200 attack and 2100 defense, and is the Pendulum Magician counterpart of Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. His monster effect reads, this card is always treated as a Fusion Dragon card. If this card is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can target one face-up card on the field, destroy it. So first, the condition of being treated as a Fusion Dragon card helps with the Chronograph or Astrograph effects to essentially Fusion summon Xiangke. The actual effect of Purple Poison, where if he was destroyed by battle or card effect, the latter which will happen more often, and you want it to happen, giving you a free pop is quite handy for Pendulum Magicians, as it gives the deck a form of removal which the deck lacked outside of Dragonpulse Magician or Timebreaker Magician. His Pendulum effect reads, once per turn, if your Dark Spellcaster type monster battles before damage calculation, you can activate this effect. That monster gains 1200 attack until the end of the damage step, then destroy this card. Now here comes the best part of Purple Poison. His Pendulum effect not only allows any of your Dark Spellcaster type monsters to potentially be over troublesome monsters, which in a Pendulum Magician deck, you'll mostly have Dark Spellcasters, but it also pops Purple Poison in the scale, which will then trigger Purple Poison's monster effect to pop one face-up card on the field. Overall, Purple Poison Magician is a very toolboxy card, allowing your Dark Spellcaster type Pendulum Magicians to potentially be over troublesome monsters, being able to pop one face-up card on the field by being destroyed by battle card effect, which its own Pendulum effect will guarantee, being a level 4 for rank 4 plays, a low scale to help out with the deck's lack of low scales in comparison to the amount of high scales the deck has, and having decent amount of defense to help protect you. I would recommend playing 2 or 3 copies in the deck to circumvent the amount of low scales in this deck. Moving on to the next Xiangke Magician, we have White Wing Magician. She is level 4 Wind Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum Tuner monster, whose Pendulum scale is 1, has 1600 attack and 1400 defense, and is the Pendulum Magician counterpart of Clear Wing Synchro Dragon. Her monster effect reads, this card is always treated as a Synchro Dragon card. If this Pendulum Summon card is used for a Synchro Summon, banish it. Like with Purple Poison and the rest of the Xiangke Magicians, the conditions of being treated as a Synchro Dragon card helps with the Chronograph and Astrograph effect to essentially Fusion summon Xiangke. From this point onwards, I'm not going to mention the condition as it's essentially the same gimmick with the rest of the Xiangke Magicians. Unlike the other Zark magicians, White Wing is the only one with just a condition as her effect, with a second condition banishing her if she was pendulum summoned and used as synchro material. I don't know why Konami likes adding restrictions onto the pendulum tuners, but it really hurts the viability of some, White Wing included. Her pendulum effect reads, once per turn, when an activated card or effect resolves that targets a Dark Spellcaster type monster you control, negate that effect, then destroy this card. A decent pendulum effect to protect your Dark Spellcasters, when in a Pendulum Magician deck, it will be a majority of your monsters. Overall, with the restrictions for her monster effects and not being a Dark Spellcaster, which actually matters a lot for this deck surprisingly, play her at 1 or none at all, more likely the latter. The only noteworthy thing about her IMO is the implications of Clearwing Synchro Dragon and his other counterparts potentially being female with White Wing existing. Next up on the Zark Magicians list, we have Black Fang Magician. He is a level 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 8, has 1700 attack and 800 defense, and is the Pendulum Magician counterpart of Dark Rebellion Xyz Dragon. His monster effect reads, this card is always treated as an Xyz Dragon card. If this card is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can target one Dark Spellcaster type monster in your graveyard, special summon it. So when I mentioned that being a Dark Spellcaster type monster matters for this deck, this is one of the 2 reasons why. Being able to revive your Dark Spellcasters after they were sent to the graveyard as either discard fodder or Xyz material is helpful. It comes up a bit when you really need it. His Pendulum effect reads, once per turn you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, its attack becomes half its current attack until the end of this turn, then destroy this card. Being able to half a monster's attack is a decent effect, but what matters the most is the fact that Black Fang then pops himself, which then triggers his monster effect to revive any of your Dark Spellcasters, which comes in handy. Overall, with a decent monster effect to revive some of your Dark Spellcasters, being a high scale, and lastly being a level 4 giving you access to your rank 4 plays, play 1 or 2 copies. Lastly on the Zark Magician list, we have Double Iris Magician. He is a level 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 8, has 1500 attack and 1000 defense, and is the Pendulum Magician counterpart of Odd Eye's Pendulum Dragon. His monster effect reads, this card is always treated as a Pendulum Dragon card. If this card is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can add one Pendulumgraph card from deck to hand. Now I said that I wouldn't talk about the condition of being treated as X card, but for Double Iris, because he is treated as a Pendulum Dragon card, he can be searched out by Duelist Alliance, which gives you about 9 copies of him if paired with Wisdom-Eye, 10 if you run one single copy of Pendulum Call, 12 if you run 3 copies of Pendulum Call. The second effect of being destroyed and grabbing your Pendulumgraph card is vital to a Pendulum Magician deck, more so for the Pendulumgraph control variant of the deck, more on the Pendulumgraph cards later. His Pendulum effect reads, once per turn you can target one Dark Spellcaster type monster you control, apply this effect to it, then destroy this card. Once applied, double any battle damage that monster inflicts to your opponent this turn if it battles an opponent's monster. The double damage effect is meh at best since it's nothing more than a reference to Odd Eye's own double damage effect. It is a fun gimmick, but what is most important about this effect is that Double Iris will pop himself, triggering his own monster effect to grab you your Pendulumgraph cards. Overall, Double Iris being a high scale level 4 Pendulum Magician that is a dark and can search your cards that can help you with grind games is extremely amazing for this deck. He is your best level 4 Pendulum Magician. Play 3 copies. Next up on the Pendulum Magician list, we have Performapal 5 Rainbow Magician. He is a level 1 Light Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 12, has 100 attack and 100 defense. His monster effect reads, if either player sets a spell or trap on your field while this card is in your grave, except during the damage step, you can place this card in your Pendulum zone. A decent monster effect to grab back a high scale after being used as discard fodder for cards such as Pendulum Call. His Pendulum effect reads, you cannot Pendulum summon except from the extra deck. This effect cannot be negated. Each player applies one of these effects based on a number of set cards in their spell and trap zone. 0. All monsters they control cannot attack or activate their effects. 4 or more. The attack of all monsters they control become double their original attack. Where to even start with this? So you lock yourself out of the one place where most of your resources will go. This card wouldn't have been too bad if they did adapt his Pendulum effect straight from the anime rather than nerfing it. So instead of 0+, it's just 0 for basically floodgating both fields, as well as getting rid of setting a card that ends the turn and skipping the draw phase to play the game without setting a card. It would have made this card much more funnier to play, but with the watered down effects of this card, it's not worth it. Overall, they should have just printed the anime version instead of whatever this is. Played 0 unless you want to roleplay or just be gimmicky, then play 1 instead. Moving on to the Pendulum Magicians and also an honorary Zark Magician, we have Performapal Celestial Magician. I say honorary because look at him. I think that comparison is enough to say why he's an honorary member. Looking at his stats, he is a level 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 8, has 1500 attack and 1000 defense. His monster effect reads, during your main phase, if this card was normal or special summon this turn, you can apply the following effect or effects for the rest of the turn based on the other monsters you currently control. Fusion, this card can attack directly. Synchro, your opponent cannot activate monster effects. Xyz, this card's attack becomes double its original attack. Pendulum, during the end phase, add a Pendulum monster from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect of Performapal Celestial Magician once per turn. Looking at his monster effect, having its effect based on what you control isn't new, but given the advantage of each type, with Synchros allowing you to lock your opponent out of monster effects for the rest of the turn, including hand traps, and Pendulums, which will be the most relevant effect for the Archetype, allowing you to add any Pendulum monster from your deck to your hand, granted it is during the end phase, like the certain Dracoslayer Xyz monster, is still a decent monster effect. His Pendulum effect reads, when exactly one face-up Fusion, Synchro, or Xyz monster you control that special summon from the extra deck is destroyed by battle or opponent's card effect, you can special summon that destroyed monster, then destroy this card. You can only use this effect of Performapal Celestial Magician once per turn. The more relevant of the two effects, as you'll most likely use Celestial Magician as a high scale. Being able to revive Fusion, Synchro, and to a lesser degree an Xyz monster by popping itself is amazing. The downside to this effect is that the monster has to be properly summoned from the extra deck, meaning Celestial Magician won't be able to bring it back if you cheat it out, and it has to exactly be one face-up monster, so if you get Raigeki, say goodbye to those monsters. Oh, and the effect is also a hard once per turn. Overall, Performapal Celestial Magician is a very toolboxy card for Pendulum Magician, and not just with his effects. He's a level 4, so he gets you access to your rank 4s or Synchro 8s plays with Harmonizing Magician. He is a Performapal, meaning he can be searched out by Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer by popping your own cards, which Pendulum Magicians love. He's also a searchable high scales, so that adds even more positive traits to this card, and being a Dark Spellcaster means he is a revival target for Black Fang, as well as a fetch for another piece of support I will talk about soon. Combining these facts with its effects, Celestial Magician is a solid additional support for the Pendulum Magician archetype. Play 1 or 2 copies, most likely 1 as most people tend to do so, since it also has to compete with the likes of Black Fang Magician and Double Iris Magician as high scales. Also, him being a walking reference to Zark and his monster effects referencing the Dimensional Dragons effect is pretty cool in my own opinion. Now here comes the last Pendulum Magician in the archetype, Magician of Hope, a walking reference to Utopia for some reason. Magician of Hope is a rank 4 light attribute spellcaster type effect Xyz pendulum monster whose pendulum scale is 8, has 2500 attack and 2000 defense, and requires 2 level 4 monsters to summon. His monster effect reads, if you can pendulum summon level 4, you can pendulum summon this face-up card in your extra deck. You can detach one material from this card, special summon one level 7 or lower pendulum monster from your hand in defense position but negate its effects. Then you can place this face-up card in your pendulum zone. You can only use this effect of Magician of Hope once per turn. If this card is pendulum summoned, you can target one pendulum monster in your grave, attach it to this card as material. The first condition is nice and gives viability to all extra deck pendulum hybrids, except you two, to be pendulum summoned. The monster effect to special summon one level 7 or lower pendulum monster from your hand in defense position with its effects negated is meh, since it does help you extend, but by the time you even summon this monster, you'll most likely not need to extend your plays. However, the part where it places itself into your pendulum scales is pretty decent, given it's a high scale. The other effect to attach any pendulum monsters from your graveyard to help recycle the first effect is pretty decent in terms of supporting itself, but again, the first effect is pretty meh. His pendulum effect reads, once per turn when a monster declares an attack, you can negate that attack, then destroy this card. Where have I heard this effect before? It's not like this card is based on an existing card or anything, but in all seriousness, it's a nice little homage to Utopia, but a battle phase effects, especially on a pendulum effect, is really lackluster and disappointing to say the least. Overall, despite being a rank 4, requiring generic materials to be summoned and easy access for pendulum magicians, the fact that Hope is an extra deck monster means that it'll be vying for a slot in an already tight extra deck. Coupled with its meh effects in comparison to something like Timestar Magician, Borreload Savage Dragon, Baron, Access Code, Appaloosa, etc., you can already see how it is lackluster and most likely not worth the spot, even with its saving grace being a high scale that can tag itself out and tag itself into your scales. Run 0. Now that we're done with going through all the Pendulum Magician monsters, we're now going to look at the support for this archetype. The first piece of support we'll be looking at is Tuning Magician, who appeared in the anime, being labelled as trash by people, whereas Yuya did not see her that way. She's a level 1 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect tuner monster that has 0 attack and 0 defense, as well as being the untrained version of Harmonizing Magician. Her monster effect reads: if you have 2 Magician cards in your Pendulum zone while this card is in your hand or graveyard, you can special summon this card but banish it when it leaves the field. You can only use this effect of Tuning Magician once per turn. If this card is normal or special summon, your opponent gains 400 life points, then you take 400 damage. Being a level 1 means she is a 1-for-1 target, and it's also pretty good that she can also special summon herself from the hand or the graveyard if you have 2 Magicians in your scales, which in a Pendulum Magician deck, this makes her the perfect discard fodder for Pendulum Call and extending your plays, giving you a guarantee that you'll be able to use her effect. Run however many you like, minimally 1. I've seen deck lists run 1, I personally run 3s to help extend my plays, so it's down to preference. Future Nana's Call here. Just so you know, after rereading that section, I can tell you that right now Tuning Magician is not worth it due to the fact that Xiangke is banned, so don't run her unless you're playing Pendulum Call, but even then, Pendulum Call isn't really worth it as it conflicts with Wisdom-eye. More on that later. Moving on to the next piece of support for Pendulum Magicians, we have Performapal Skullcrobat Joker. Performapal Skullcrobat Joker is a level 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Pendulum monster whose Pendulum scale is 8, has 1800 attack and 100 defense. His monster effect reads: when this card is normal summon, you can add 1 Performapal monster, Magician Pendulum monster, or Odd Eyes monster from your deck to your hand, except Performapal Skullcrobat Joker. The amount of archetype this thing searches is insane. Being a Stratos for 3 different archetypes is extremely funny and could never go wrong. Aside from that, what can I say? An amazing effect tailored to 3 different archetypes, making it an instant must-have for Pendulum Magicians. His Pendulum effect reads: you cannot Pendulum summon monsters except Performapal monsters, Magician Pendulum monsters, and Odd Eyes monsters. This effect cannot be negated. Given its monster effect being extremely insane and also being a high scale, I can see why he was given this restriction. But man, does it suck that he does not have any other effects other than the Pendulum summoning restriction. Overall, what can I say? The Stratos of your deck, being a high scale and being a level 4 Dark Spellcaster, enabling your plays as well as being a very versatile card. It's most likely your normal summon for this deck, so play 3 copies. Next up we have Enlightenment Paladin, who appeared in the anime. He's a level 8 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Synchro monster, who has 2500 attack, 2000 defense, and requires 1 tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters to summon. His monster effect reads: if this card is synchro summoned using a Magician Pendulum monster as a material, you can target 1 spell card in your graveyard, add it to your hand. You can only use this effect of Enlightenment Paladin once per turn. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. So if you synchro summon it using a Pendulum Magician as a material, you get to recycle a spell card, which realistically it will most likely be Duelist Alliance. And then there's the battle effect. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can burn your opponent for the original monster's attack, which is meh at best and very wasteful at worst. Overall, there are better extra deck options for Pendulum Magicians, especially a level 8 Synchro, which Pendulum Magicians love to go into. Don't play unless you're going for the whole roleplay experience. Now here comes the next piece of support for the Pendulum Magician archetype, which, spoiler alert, ended up being a mainstay for the archetype. Here is Timestar Magician. Timestar Magician is a rank 4 Dark Attribute Spellcaster type effect Xyz monster who has 2400 attack and 1200 defense and requires 2 level 4 Magician Pendulum monsters to summon. His monster effect reads: must first be Xyz summoned with the above Xyz materials. Once per turn, you can detach 1 Xyz material from this card. Add to your hand 1 Dark Spellcaster type monster from your deck, graveyard, or face up from your extra deck. Once per turn, if a Pendulum monster card or cards in your Monster Zone or Pendulum Zone would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can send 1 Spellcaster type monster from your deck to the graveyard instead. So first having to be Xyz summoned means that you can bring it back with either Celestial Magician's Pendulum effect or with Blackfang's monster effect later, which is good since its third effect is a protection effect for any of your Pendulum cards by foolishing a spellcaster instead. The first effect is why having Dark Spellcasters in your deck also matters, as this card can grab you any of your Dark Spellcasters, not restricted to just Pendulum monsters mind you, and it's from mostly anywhere it can grab from. Lastly, as mentioned, the third effect is a protection effect for all your pendulum cards you control, which is insanely good when combined with the continuous trap Time Pendulum Graph, helping you bypass card effects and targeting protection with trap, being able to send any card on the field to the graveyard in the same chain link if it fails to pop 2 cards on the field. With all this in mind, you play this minimally at 1 if you're not playing a dedicated build for the Time Pendulum Graph control version of the deck, and if you are, play 2. This card is just that good to not consider it for Pendulum Magicians. Now for a piece of support that was surprisingly limited at one point and then came back to 3 copies, only for most of the modern decks just to play 1 copy and unsure if they should play 2 copies or cut it all out together instead. We have Pendulum Call. Pendulum Call is a normal spell card and its effect reads: discard 1 card, add 2 Magician Pendulum monsters with different names from your deck to your hand. Also, until the end of your opponent's next turn after this card resolves, Magician cards in your Pendulum zones cannot be destroyed by card effects. You can only activate 1 Pendulum Call per turn. You cannot activate this card if you activate a Magician monster's Pendulum effect this turn. Like mentioned before, Pendulum Call was once a staple of the Pendulum Magician archetype that you played at 3 copies, since it lets you search out your Pendulum Magicians and protects your scale from being blown up until the end of the next turn, at the cost of the discard, and top of being searchable off of Duelist Alliance. This was until the ban list limited it to 1 copy. But as new support came out and the card coming off the ban list, most modern incarnations of Pendulum Magicians would rather have their scales blown up, which is the exact opposite of what Pendulum Call does for you. Not to mention the consistency of Pendulum Magicians having been elevated with the introduction of Wisdom-eye Magician and Double Iris Magician, with Double Iris being searchable off of Duelist Alliance as well. Play 1 or 2, as you may need it to unbrick your hands from time to time. If not, you could always just play it at 0 copies. The next 2 support I'll be talking about will be the second aforementioned Pendulum Graph cards, starting with Star Pendulum Graph. Star Pendulum Graph is a continuous spell card whose effect reads: your opponent cannot target spellcaster type monsters you control with spell cards or spell effects. If a face-up Magician Pendulum monster card or cards leaves your monster zone or pendulum zone, add 1 Magician Pendulum monster from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect of Star Pendulum Graph once per turn. So first off, this card is searchable by both Double Iris Magician and Duelist Alliance, with the former searching for Pendulum Graph cards and the latter searching for cards with Pendulum in the name. The effect that protects your spellcasters from being targeted by spell cards and their spell effects is decent, but hardly comes up nowadays. The next effect is what matters about this card, giving you a mandatory search if your Pendulum Magicians leave your monster zone or scales, which is decent to extend your plays and or fixing your hand. Keeping all this in mind, you play 1 at the minimum. And now onto the next and final support, Time Pendulum Graph. Time Pendulum Graph is a continuous trap whose effect reads: your opponent cannot target spellcaster type monsters you control with trap cards or trap effects. You can only use the following effect of Time Pendulum Graph once per turn. You can target 1 Magician Pendulum monster card in your monster zone or pendulum zone, and 1 card your opponent controls. Destroy them. Then, if this effect did not destroy 2 cards, you can send 1 card on the field to the graveyard. Send. Not destroy, send. Between the 2 Pendulum Graph cards we've talked about, this is the 1 card you always want to search out. Sure, the trap protection is pretty neat, making sure your opponent can't imperm any of your spellcasters, but the main effect you really care about is being able to pop 2 cards, which then, combined with Timestar Magician, you can send the card on the field to the graveyard. Non-targeting removal in a Pendulum Magician deck really helps, especially in the control variant. Play 1 minimally. Here are some honorable mentions that don't mention Magician Pendulum monsters in their text, but do support the Pendulum mechanic as a whole, and that does see use in Pendulum Magician decks and are not part of an engine, an example being the Darkworm engine. I won't be going in depth with their effects, but I'll talk about the relevant effects of them that help Pendulum Magicians in a brief summary. We have Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer. Searchable by Joker and helps you to pop up to 2 of your cards if he's special summoned, either by Pendulum summoning or by being summoned off of Selene, Queen of the Master Magicians, allowing you to search out Performapals, mainly another Joker, Odd-Eye Synchron, another tuner to consider, and or Celestial Magician, which is part of the Performapal archetype. There's also the fact that he searches out Performapal Odd-Eye's Dissolver, which is a fusion on legs, basically. It has decent synergy with Pendulum Magicians due to being able to pop and resetting your scales. Play 1 minimally, current deck list suggests playing 3, so it boils down to preference. Lust the Pendulum is another card people often use in Pendulum Magicians due to having a pendulum in the name, making it searchable off of Duelist Alliance.
Commonly used for its scale effect to pop your own scales, mostly double iris, to trigger its monster effect. Yes, it has a passable high scale, but it's a bit of a garnet since it can only be used for the summon of a Draco Slayer monster, if it were to be used as a fusion, synchro, or Xyz material. And if it were in the scale, it's going to turn off your Wisdom-eye and Oafdragon scale effects. Play one copy. Now, I'm only mentioning Odd-Eye's Pendulumgraph Dragon not because it helps out Pendulum Magicians or anything, in fact it's probably better off in an Odd-Eye's deck, but I'm mentioning this card solely due to the fact it is a Pendulumgraph card which is searchable by Double Iris Magician. I can't exactly talk about Pendulum as a whole without talking about this one card that broke pendulums as a mechanic, which is Heavy Metal Foes Electrumite. Heavy Metal Foes Electrumite is a link to fire attribute psychic type effect link monster who has 1800 attacks with arrows pointing to the bottom left and bottom right, and the summoning conditions are 2 pendulum monsters to summon. Her effect, yes, it's a her effect reads: if this card is link summoned, you can add 1 pendulum monster from your deck to your extra deck face up. Once per turn, you can target 1 other face-up card you control, destroy it, then add 1 face-up pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. If a card or cards in your pendulum zone leaves the field, draw a card. You can only use this effect of Heavy Metal Foes Electrumite once per turn. What made this card insane is a combination of its soft once per turn destruction and recycle effects, all in one effect mind you. Astrograph Sorcerer being searched out by this thing on summon, then being recycled by the said destruction effect, allowing you to summon Astrograph since he specials himself whenever a card or cards you control is destroyed, and fetching whatever another copy of the cards you controlled which was destroyed that turn, which isn't once per turn either. This in combination making another Electrumite with Astro and another Pendulum monster you control, then repeating this process over again, netting you card advantage. Another factor is 2 other cards that were used in this process being that Double Iris Magician and Supreme King Starving Venom, the former grabbing your Pendulumgraph cards to help gain more advantage or an interruption, and the latter being able to copy Electrumite's effect. I guess the hard once per turn drawing from Electrumite was just the cherry on top, being unnecessary in comparison to the process I mentioned. Overall, there's a very good reason why this card was limited then outright banned in the TCG, but not before it took so many cards with it onto the ban list. Unless of course you're playing Master Duel or in the OCG territories, in which case you absolutely must play it at 1 since it's limited there. Safe to say, this card is never coming off the ban list in the TCG. Next up we have the new support for pendulums, Beyond the Pendulum. I talked about Electrumite first because in order to talk about Beyond the Pendulum, I need a comparison for this card. Beyond the Pendulum is a link to Dark Attribute Spellcaster Effect Link Monster who has 1200 attacks with arrows pointing to the bottom left and bottom right, and the summoning conditions are 2 effect monsters including a Pendulum monster. Her effect reads: if this card is link summoned to the extra monster zone, you can pay 1200 life points, add a Pendulum monster from your deck to your hand. After adding it to your hand until the end of this turn, you cannot activate monster effects. Also, the effects of cards in your Pendulum zones are negated until you Pendulum summon. If 2 monsters with different original levels are pendulum summoned at the same time to the zone this card points to, you can target 2 cards on the field, destroy them. You can only use this effect of Beyond the Pendulum once per turn. What can I say? Her first effect is similar to Electrumite, with both having an on-summon effect that searches out a pendulum monster, but unlike Electrumite, you're locked out of both your monster effects and pendulum effects until you pendulum summon after you add the monster. Also, her effect having a life points cost. Her second effect is decent as it allows you to pop 2 cards on the field, primarily but not limited to your scales. But the condition to have 2 monsters with different levels needing to be pendulum summoned to the zone sheet points to means that you best pray you don't have mostly your level 4s being summoned to her zones. Alternatively, you can use her search effect to search for Astrograph in order to ensure you get her second effect to activate. Overall, Beyond the Pendulum is nothing more than a watered down version of Electrumite, which in the TCG you're more or less wanting to use her. But everywhere else, you're honestly better off running Electrumite. Even in the OCG's recent topping at the time of writing this section, Pendulum Magicians run Electrumite over Beyond the Pendulum. Just shows how good Electrumite really is. Play 1 in the TCG, play 0 or 1 everywhere else. Next up we have the aforementioned Duelist Alliance. No, not the booster set, the spell card. Duelist Alliance is a normal spell card whose effect reads: if there is a card in the Pendulum zone, add 1 Pendulum monster or Pendulum spell trap from your deck to your hand. You can only activate 1 Duelist Alliance per turn. Take a shot every time I said pendulum in that sentence. This is a good card. In a Pendulum Magician deck, it searches your Pendulum Call to get you your scales, your Double Iris Magician since it's always treated as a Pendulum Dragon card, your Pendulum Sorcerer to pop your scales, and your Pendulumgraph cards. Play 3 copies. It is that good. An old school card on the list. Next up we have Wavering Eyes. Wavering Eyes is a quick play spell card with the following effect: destroy as many cards in each player's pendulum zone as possible, then apply these effects in sequence depending on the number of cards destroyed by this effect. 1 or more, inflicts 500 damage to your opponent. 2 or more, you can add a pendulum monster from your main deck to your hand. 3 or more, you can banish 1 card in the field. 4, you can add 1 Wavering Eyes from the deck to your hand. Overall, this card saw fair usage at the beginning of the Pendulum era, to the point where it was put on the ban list at 1 copy, then subsequently banned. Then unbanned at 1 copy, then put back to free. Not really considered today, you can always play it in this deck at 3 copies. I tried it just like another Pendulum Magician player I know, and it does what Electrumite does for the deck, which is amazing. Play either 3 or none at all. Overall, Pendulum Magicians are a solid deck that have fallen from their time in the spotlight, not being even remotely rogue anymore due to the advent of links hindering pendulums as a mechanic, as well as the lack of support to make the mechanic even remotely relevant. There's also the fact that hand traps easily interrupt it, and Nibiru just decimates the deck. And with Halkban, you can't really go into Apollosa combos to stop at the 5th summon, basically making Apollosa on the 5th summon to negate Nib. So Pendulum Magicians aren't really rogue anymore. Anyway, here's a sample deck list of Pendulum Magicians. I just hope Konami can give it more support in the future, even though it just did get support with Dimension Force. Oh well. Thank you for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it, so here's some bloopers. After that, this is Ananascore signing out. Goodbye.
I've seen one or two decks. I can't speak, fuck. Onto the house get, and is the Pendulum Magician counterpart, and is the Pendulum Magician counterpart of the Odd Eyes, His monster effect reads, this is a card. Moving on to the Pendulum Magicians, and also an honorary Zark Magician. Honorary Zark Magician. I say honorary. You're most likely not to extend. The first effect is why having doubt. Dick.